my pleasure to chair this session on the transnational dynamics of the religious landscape. The first speaker is Denis Brylov, and he's a senior researcher at the Krymsky Institute of Oriental Studies, the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and a research fellow at the Library Centrum Moderne Orient in Berlin. So, Denis, please.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Heather and Stefka, who had to listen to my reports about how I get my visa. Yeah. And secondly, I would like to congratulate yesterday's commemoration of the UN Day Against Islamophobia, because it's a topic very close with my subject. Let me turn to the direct subject of my reports. Between Ummah and nation, the impact of the Ukraine war on the Muslim communities. The Russian invasion in Ukraine has raised the question of choice of identity for all religious organizations, whether they are first and foremost believers of their own denomination, often transnational in nature, or citizen of Ukraine defining their right to have national identity in the face of aggression, of Russian aggression. The most famous case of this clash of these identities, religious and national, in the situation around the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. However, to a lesser extent, such a clash occurs in any religious group that assumes a broader religious identity than the national one. Such a religious group is the Muslim community of Ukraine, which consists of various ethnic and ideological groups that often feel a sense of belonging to communities, ethnic, ideological, outside of Ukraine. These communities do not always feel the same way about the Russian war in Ukraine as their representatives living in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, representatives of Ukrainian Muslims associations have played a certain role in shaping the attitude of the Muslim world to the war. In particular, at the beginning of the hostilities, Sheikh Ahmed Tamim, Mufti of Religious Administration of Muslim of Ukraine, appealed to Muslims worldwide to support Ukraine. Later, Yahya Shalil Stakuf, the leader of the world's largest Muslim organization with Indonesian origin, Nahdlatul Ulama, for example, it's Sufi ritual Sheikh Ahmed Tamim, and Indonesian Muslims, Indonesian Sufi from Nahdlatul Ulama, and the Grand Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, Egyptian Al-Azhar University, Sheikh Al-Taib, Ahmed Al-Taib, both of whom have close ties with Sheikh Ahmed Tamim, called for cessation hostilities in Ukraine. The European Council of Muslim Leaders, ULEMA, responded to Tamim's call by showing their support for Ukraine. Under leadership of Sheikh Haider Rustemov, another Ukrainian Muslim association, the Religious Administration of Muslims of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, maintained close ties with the Turkish Department of Religion Affairs, Diyanet, and regularly raised the issue of increasing support for Muslims in Ukraine in the face of Russian military aggression. In addition, he has repeatedly made statements to Russian Muslims urging them not to take part in a war that cannot be justified from a Sharia perspective. Another Ukrainian Muslim leader, ex-Mufti of the Religious Administration of Muslim of Ukraine, Ummah, Sheikh Said Ismagilov, called on Muslims in Russia not to take part in the war and to start a liberation movement. At the same time, it should be noted that the Islamic world has taken a cautious stance since the beginning of the Russian invasion. While the UN General Assembly resolution condemning the war, ES 11/1, and the resolution condemning Russia's annexation for 4 Ukrainian territories, ES 11/4, were supported by the majority of Muslim countries. Some of them abstained the initiative, but the initiative to exclude Russia from the UN Human Rights Council received much less support for them. With regard to anti-Russian sanctions, the position of Muslim countries is even more negative. In particular, the Secretary General of the Arab League, Ahmed Abu Ghaid, said the Arab states believe that the issue of sanctions should be resolved only within the framework of the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. Other case, Indonesia, the largest Muslim state in the world, also refused to support the sanction. At the same time, the weakening of Russia in the course of its confrontation with the West makes it a more attractive partner for the same Muslim states, and in general, the countries in the global south, as it makes relation between the parties more equal. The different attitudes within the global Muslim Ummah have no less complicated attitudes towards the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. Summarizing, I can distinguish three main positions among Muslim community representatives. First position is that Russia and Ukraine are non-Muslim countries, are non-Muslim states, so their conflict does not concern Muslims or should be used in the interest of Muslims. This position is widespread among parts of the Salafi movement, including jihadist movement. A vivid example of such an attitude is the position of Abdul Karim Krymsky, commander of the Crimean Tatar Jamaat, military detachment within Jaish al-Muhajirun wal-Ansar, its jihadi group, who at the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in 2014 equated Ukraine and Russia with the territories where infidels, kafir, humiliate Muslims. In his opinion, it is useless for Crimean Tatars to appeal to international organization, and they have to start an open war with non-believers. He said, "We see that Muslims and Tatars who moved to Ukraine and humbled it, while here in Syria, the Muslims are walking with heads held high. We just see the difference. We ask Allah that He will set Tatars, the people of Crimea, on the spot, namely jihad, so that we could, through joint efforts, establish the laws of Allah on this land." The transnational Islamist movement, Hizb ut-Tahrir, views the situation from a similar position. On the movement's webpage, we can find the following statement. From the point of view of Sharia, it is a grave sin to take part in a war, either on the side of Russia or on the side of Ukraine, because it is a battle on the side of disbelief and under the flag of disbelief. This is the situation of the Muslims of Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea now. They go to die under the banner of the disbelievers on the part of Tagut, idolater. And those under Russian rule still go to die for their own occupier. Moreover, Hizb ut-Tahrir has a rather ambiguous position on Ukraine. Members of Hizb ut-Tahrir refer Crimea to Darul Harb, territory of wars, namely Muslim lands that have been occupied, where Islam is oppressed and must be liberated. At the same time, the Ukrainian representatives of Hizb ut-Tahrir found themselves in a difficult situation, as Ukrainian authorities actively support them in the condition of war, using the situation with the persecution of Hizb ut-Tahrir by the occupying Russian authorities in Crimea to attract the attention of human rights defenders and Western partners, at first UN, OBSE, and others. An understanding was also reached with the leadership of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, with which Hizb ut-Tahrir was in conflict until the annexation of Crimea by Russia. However, the question remains open as to what position Hizb ut-Tahrir will take after the end of the war and the disappearance of the need for a situational alliance with the Ukrainian authorities. Idolater in Hizb ut-Tahrir position. In addition, it is important to take into account that Hizb ut-Tahrir is banned in Ukraine's largest European allies, Germany and Great Britain. And it is also difficult to predict how long the current situational alliance will be supported by the Ukrainian government. Second position is to support Russia and its invasion in Ukraine. This position is observed primarily on the part of Russian official muftiyats, who are trying to theologically justify the legitimacy of the participation of their believers in this war. In particular, Russian Muslim associations adopted a joint statement calling the Russian invasion a forced measure to protect Russia from the threat of nuclear and biological weapon from NATO countries. The statement was signed by all the Mufti of North Caucasus Muslim Coordination Center and was also supported by Talgat Tajuddin, chairman of the Central Spiritual Board of Muslim of Russia and Supreme Mufti of Russia, Albir Kurganov, chairman of the Spiritual Assembly of Muslim of Russia, Kamil Samigulin, Mufti of Tatarstan, and Aynur Birgalin, Mufti of Bashkortostan. Ravil Gainuddin, head of spiritual administration of Muslim of the Russian Federation, took a more cautious stance, calling for prayers for peace and the preservation of human life. But later, he also joined in supporting the actions of the Russian authorities. Later, various muftis, in particular Talgat Tajuddin and Chechen Mufti Salah Mejiev, issued religious opinions, fatwas, that the war in Ukraine is considered a jihad, holy war, and that Russian Muslims who die in this war become martyrs for the faith, namely shahid. It should be taken into account that the position of Russian muftis to some extent influences Ukrainian Muslims, primarily those who come from Russian region with an ethnic Muslim majority, in particular the Muslim Republic of North Caucasus, and to a lesser extent Bashkortostan and Tatarstan. The transnational Islamic movement Hamas, with followers among Russians and Ukrainians, until recently was the Palestinian branch of the global Muslim Brotherhood movement and demonstrated the strongest pro-Russian stance. In particular, during his visit to Moscow in 2022, the first deputy chairman of the Hamas Politburo, Musa Abu Marzouk, stated that Hamas supports Russia's action in Ukraine. He said, Russia's special military operation in Ukraine aims to end US dominance in the world, to make the world multipolar. This is beneficial to all oppressed peoples, especially the Palestinian people, as the most suffering from American hegemony. Therefore, we support Russia's efforts to form a multipolar world. The pro-Russian position of Hamas has led to the fact that some Ukrainian Muslims who are ideologically close to the Muslim Brotherhood have been faced with a choice as to how they should feel about such statements by Hamas. However, the fact that some of the leading figures of this group of Muslims regularly spoke out to support the Islamic resistance movement, Hamas. In particular, as head of Congress of Muslim of Ukraine and member of Sharia Committee, Ramu Ummah Seyran Arifov wrote, "We have no reason to accuse Hamas of terrorism for waging armed struggle against an occupier who attacked Palestinian land, killed women and children, expelled Palestinians from their land, and destroyed their homes." The situation became even more paradoxical after the Hamas attacked on Israel in October 2023. The Hamas leadership explicitly stated that it was because of their attack that the US attention was diverted from the Russian war in Ukraine. Khaled Mashal, he said, "We want the Arab communities in the West to be active, and we want cooperation with superpowers like China and Russia. For your information, Russia has benefited from our attack because we distracted US from them and from Ukraine. China saw our attack as a dazzling example. The Russian told us that what happened on October 7 would be taught in military academies. Other co-founder of Hamas, Mahmoud al-Zahir, say about Ukraine, it's great Jewish country in Eastern Europe. Its position, leaders of Hamas. As a result, this group of Ukrainian Muslims, while adopting a pro-Ukrainian position in public discourse, remains completely silent about Hamas actions in support of Russian aggression. The interview with the most media-savvy Ukrainian Muslim leader, Said Ismailov, who is also a representative of those Muslims in Ukraine who are ideologically close to the Muslim Brotherhood, was revealing. He described the attitude of the Islamic world towards Ukraine in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine. He noted that it has worsened because of the Middle East conflict, its new stage, which began in October 2023. He said the situation has not improved. It was worsened because of the Middle East conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and UFAS that began last October. And all of this is being manipulated very successfully by the Russian propaganda. Some Ukrainians are on the side of Israel. Some Muslims in Ukraine are sympathetic to Palestine. I have not seen any strong support from either Israel or Palestine for us. At the same time, Ismailov avoided mention of Hamas and its role in the diversion in attention from Ukraine, attributing the main role in this to Russian propaganda. It's ворожа станція. Це ворожа станція. And third position represents support for Ukraine in its opposition to Russian armed aggression. Of course, the main bearers of this position are the Muslims of Ukraine. A significant part of Ukrainian Muslims from various ethnic groups were opposite the Russian invasion, not only condemning the invasion, but also actively joining the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces and volunteer battalions. Currently, the largest groups of Muslims within the armed forces of Ukraine are the Crimean Tatars and Azerbaijanis, whose number is 500 people each. The leaders of almost all Ukrainian Muslim associations spoke out against aggression and in support of Ukraine. I already mentioned this above. As for support for Ukraine from the outside, from Muslim in other countries, first of all, these are unofficial communities, often banned, of Russian Muslims. Support for Ukraine from Russian Muslims is partly explained by the fact that it is military personnel from the North Caucasus and the Baikal region who make up a disproportionately large share of these units taking part in hostilities. There is also criticism of the Russian invasion, in particular from Salafi communities. For example, the famous Dagestani Salafi preacher Abu Umar Sitlinsky generally states the Muslims serving under contract in the Russian army are apostates, namely murtadi, but only contract. The largest group of Russian Muslims supporting Ukraine and fighting on the side of the Ukrainian defense forces are Chechens. Since the second half of 2022, Ahmed Zakayev, a Chechen politician and field commander, diplomatic representative of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, who is called in the Ukrainian media the head of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in exile, began to actively visit Ukraine. He said, today the army of the Chechen state is being restored and revived in Ukraine as a part of the International Legion of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Besides, anti-Russian Chechens received support from the Ukrainian authorities. The latter recognized the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, the name of independent Chechnya, as a territory temporarily occupied by Russia. Most Chechen fighters hope to liberate their homeland after Ukrainians' victory and with its help. For example, Chechen volunteers say the situation in Russia will change and we will move with the weapons across Georgia into the mountainous regions of Chechnya and liberate them. In this way, we will gradually liberate city after city. Young people will rush to us along the mountain paths. It will be a national liberation movement. Some Chechens hope to avenge Russia for the death of their relatives and the destruction of Chechnya. In general, the Russian war in Ukraine has shown that the Muslims of Ukraine, in spite of their different origins, stay as a community that is loyal to the state. In large part, this loyalty is due to the religious freedoms granted by the Ukrainian state. This is contrast to Russia, where Muslims are often persecuted and discriminated. On the other hand, as part of the global Ummah, Ukrainian Muslims must confront on the more influential pro-Russian discourse in the Arab Muslim world. In most cases, the confrontation is not in favor of Ukrainian Muslims. Either they are little known in most Muslim countries, or they are restricted by reference group in the Islamic world. At the same time, Muslims born in Ukraine, even if they belong to ethnic minorities, are the most loyal to Ukraine. It can be said that their national identity is dominant. For some migrant Muslims, loyalty to Ukraine is often less important. As Said Ismagilov, ex-Mufti Ummah, stated, we have another problem. Muslims in Ukraine are still migrants. Migrants from different countries who came to Ukraine, got citizenship or permission to stay here, got married, and most of them, after the full-scale war broke out, decided not to help and protect, but to flee to Europe. In any case, the Russian war in Ukraine has led to serious changes within the Ukrainian community, and in many cases, these changes have involved question of identity. The Muslims of Ukraine were faced with the choice of who they should consider themselves to be first and foremost, citizen of their country or members of the global religion community, the interests of which do not always coincide with the interest of Ukraine. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Dennis. That was really interesting. The next speaker is Tatiana Vagramenko. She is postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cork in Ireland, and she'll be speaking on endangered memory, religious minorities archives during war.
I'm an anthropologist, like Denise, anthropologist of religion, but I was never trained to be anthropologist of war, and I never intended to do any research in conflict zones. And I think this lack of experience we all share in this room, something that we started to do from scratch. When the war began in February 2014, I found myself on the Maidan. Then I went to Crimea, and I was there during the annexation. I witnessed military people without identification and tanks passing the streets of my home, where my parents live. I guess that moment was a turning point when I started reading about anthropology of war, and that was the moment when I changed my research completely. When the whole-scale war began in February 2022, that was the moment when I stopped reading at all for some time, and I'm still struggling with this, and I stopped writing for a while because I had no sense, I saw no meaning in what I've done before, what for if I could change anything. So I'm saying this because when I submitted this paper for this conference, I kind of reflected more about myself, about methodological uncertainties that I have, and how I've been struggling, like sharing my own experience, how I've been struggling with both my existential crisis and professional crisis. So the paper turned into kind of something quite personal as I tried to process the topics of the war, my research, my relationship with research participants, and my role as an anthropologist. I found that storytelling approach was quite helpful in coming to terms with new aspects of my career and my life. And it's quite experimental to me, so I would like to hear your critical comments and some insights of how it reads. The stories in this paper emerged as a kind of side effect of my original project. I've been doing research on the history of religious underground in Soviet Ukraine since 2014. And I've been interested in history of in collaboration stories, basically in policing religion in Soviet Ukraine, in religious minorities, primarily of Protestant origins, but not only, in their encounters with the Soviet secret police. I was interested in religious minorities that were mainly majorly outlawed during the Soviet period, and they formed the so-called religious underground, and they became the primary target of the KGB. Collaboration stories of secret operations, infiltrations of these communities, and the culture of everyday surveillance in Soviet Ukraine. That was my focus of my research, and I spent a good number of years in Soviet-era archives, including the archive of the Security Service of Ukraine, the former KGB archive in Kyiv and across other regions in Ukraine. As an anthropologist, doing kind of anthropological fieldwork in archives, reconstructing stories from that period. And my idea was that after I found this and reconstruct the stories I found in these archives, I would bring them to the communities, those communities I located, the history of whom I located in the archives. And I would bring these stories and we would read it together. And my hypothesis was that communities' archives, those archives that preserved and created by communities, would provide in a kind of alternative insight. There would be what late Sonia Lurman calls the counter-archives that would provide different perspective on this story, and we would process these quite ethically and morally wrenching moments of their history together. This stage, when I was about to start working with religious communities and bringing these stories to them, this stage coincided day by day with the beginning of the second stage of the war in February 2022. And of course, this has changed a lot the focus of my study. I try to follow the lives of community archives during the wartime in Ukraine, focusing on their role as tangible repositories of historical memory that became so vulnerable amidst Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Given their minority status and sometimes lack of official registration with local authorities, these religious minorities, Protestant in this case, all of them, fight on their own to protect their historical legacy, their archives, their prayer houses, and at times their own lives. The archives in the focus of this research were either relocated, smuggled, destroyed, stolen, or conversely opened after several decades of being concealed from outsiders' eyes. And that was all the result of the war. What unites them all is their shared history deeply rooted in the Soviet past, a time marked by suppression, secrecy, and control. And this legacy of secrecy and survival continues to shape the fate and identities of these communities up to nowadays. Following Michael Rolfe's Trouillot argument on the power dynamic inherent in historical narration, the community archives in this research are seen less as a repository of historical data than as contested sites of memory, imbued with the force of meaning-making. Particularly amidst the backdrop of the memory wars that fueled the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, these archives assume new significance. As a range of scholars point out, the current war was partly caused by Russia's failure to adequately confront and process its Soviet past, which shows the enduring power of historical legacy in shaping present realities. So in this context, local communities and their archives wield new force and new agency. During my field research in the last 2 years, it became evident that these community archives were more than just repositories of historical documents. Instead, amidst the war, they emerged as powerful tools for community activism and memory practices. As communities strive to save, to relocate, to conceal, or to unveil once hidden and now endangered archival materials, they assert agency in reclaiming their narratives and their histories, positioning themselves as important actors in the ongoing process of what is remembered, what is forgotten, and what is silenced. So in my piece that I've submitted for this conference, I write about 4 cases, 4 archives from various religious communities, from various regions of Ukraine, including the occupied territory of Crimea. I would focus today on only 2 for the sake of time. The first case was kind of still remain a significant moral dilemma to me, because I'm not sure how or whether I should write about this case. I'll tell you why. Because it involves serious legal and ethical issues. Yet it stands as one of the most important cases in my research, shedding light on the enduring Soviet legacy and resilience of some Soviet forms and practices in religious spheres in Ukraine up to nowadays. In September 22, I met a minister, I would call him Fedor, from a religious community that I do not name, in a town that I do not name either. I came to his prayer house, and my idea was to interview him about the history of his community, the history of policing of his community, and topics that were interested: collaboration, agent infiltration, and secret KGB secret operations against his community. I was accompanied by my gatekeeper in this research, who introduced me to several communities in this region where I worked. He arranged several interviews, and he showed quite interest in my research, and basically he went with me for every interview and sat at every interviews. It was a retired professor. As we sat in Fedor's office, the 3 of us, including professor, I noticed an unusual tension. I noticed that while I asked questions, Fedor was answering but responding not to me, but to a professor. Kind of his gaze passing through me and looking to the place where professor was sitting. I found it quite interesting because it was not the first time, because the previous 3 interviews with other representatives of other religious communities happened the same. I was answering the questions, and my respondent was answering, looking at the professor. So I kind of realized that there was some kind of hidden dialogue between them. Interview finished. I left the prayer house, and in an hour, Fedor called me by phone and asked to come the following day alone. You would be surprised, but it was not the first time. The previous two interviews happened exactly the same. After the interview finished, I received a phone call from that person and got an invitation to come the following day on my own. But Fedor was the only one who explained why. "You must understand," I quote, "that I couldn't say everything in front of the professor. Of course, I was already saying more than I should because I have nothing left to fear, but still the professor is following everything I say." He confirmed what I was already suspecting. The professor and my gatekeeper in research on policing religion in the USSR was part of the system. During the Soviet era, he worked for the KGB as a KGB agent, being responsible for monitoring certain religious communities in the region. For many years, he has served as one of the main channels between religious communities and the Soviet authorities, basically surveilling and reporting on everything that was happening in these communities. Despite being retired and no longer active, the influence of his former position still lingered. I later interviewed the professor, and more or less he told me the entire story, which I do not integrate in this research because I don't know really how to process it yet. All I can say that he said to me, "I still keep them all under control." His story was fascinating, but what fascinated me all was not the story of his activity during the Soviet period, but his activities of the 30 years of Ukraine's independence, how he capitalized on his experience of being a KGB agent, and how he basically kept controlling in different ways religious communities in the region. So these connections was never severed, never truly ended even after 30 years of Ukraine's independence. Fedor lamented that the authorities kept pressing him, always trying to control. I quote, "Even these days, they constantly come to me and say, 'Well, you're an honest person, let's collaborate.' Well, precisely because I am an honest person, I don't want to be bothered. I've had enough of the Soviet period. I already struggled with them back then." But this was not the reason Fedor wanted me to see me again. As a man of history, whose eyes sparked every time we talked about things from the past, he wanted to narrate his own account of the events. Being interested in the topic of my research, he wanted to work with me, to co-write what he says, a new history. I quote, "Let's write together about this all, about how people collaborated with the secret police, how they recruited secret informers and agents, giving all the names and in an open and direct way, so that everybody knows, and to prevent such things from happening again." Then he showed to me his real treasure. He put a bulky plastic bag on the table. That was his secret archive, hidden for many years from all. Inside were dozens of folders, which I immediately recognized. It was documents from a Soviet-era state archive, typical folders of surveillance and records on religious communities in the region. In the next few days, Fedor brought me many more such plastic bags, full of documents. These records span several decades, detailing the life of his community, their members, photographs of prayer houses, correspondence between various state organs, surveillance report, intercepted letters, and so on. The full account of how the state surveilled and controlled and oppressed religious life back in the Soviet period. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Fedor managed to bribe an archivist from formerly Soviet State Archive, and he basically stole an entire archival collection related to his community. I quote, "This is entire history of my community, so it belongs to us, not to them." Fedor was convinced. With this material, the community tried to restore hidden pages of their history, to trace the stories of their predecessors, to reconstruct events that shaped their identity, and identify those among them who secretly collaborated with the state and spied upon them. Fedor wanted to share his treasure with me, suggesting that we write this history together. He wanted me to digitize this collection because he was afraid that it would be destroyed as a result of the war. So in the next several days, I was digitizing an archival collection I knew I would never be able to show to anyone, and I would never to use it in my research. But Fedor insisted. For him, this was the way to fight the enduring impact of the Soviet legacy, which continued to influence the lives of his community and possibly many others in Ukraine. This was an act to resist, to fight. I quote, "So this would not happen again," that he kept repeating. So this case underscores how Soviet habitus in meaning-making, in practices and communication persist today, revealing that the Soviet past often remains unresolved and in certain forms still influence contemporary society. And it was the ongoing war that helped to unveil these hidden forms and practices. And the revealing of the stolen archive was one of the ways to resist this enduring Soviet legacy. I will skip two cases of secret archives previously all the time was secret and revealing and open to me. That was community of Baptist unregistered group and Jehovah's Witnesses. You can find it in a paper. And the last case is a smuggled archive. This case I described briefly in the chapter in the Dispossession book edited by Catherine Water. And this is a story of an archive that belongs to the Adventist community in Simferopol that was secretly smuggled in 2014 after Russia's occupation of Crimea. It was a very dramatic story. I recommend you to read it. The story of rescuing and smuggling an entire archive with the police of the occupational regime, surveilling, chasing the archive, nearly intercepting the moment when the owner of the archive was secretly crossing the border. So this here would be the continuation of the story. This story told me an owner and a creator of this archive. I would call him Artyom, although I have to probably to de-anonymize him because he became part of my project. So when I visited him in Bucha, he managed to bring the archive from Crimea, from occupied Crimea to Bucha, where the Ukrainian Adventist headquarters located. During the occupation of Bucha in March 2022, the building where the archive was stored was captured by Russian soldiers. While they were based there, they damaged furniture, broke windows and doors, stole money and valuables, and destroyed all digital devices. Artyom lost all digital copies, all digital collections. He was devastated when he saw his archive after the liberation of Bucha. The tangible memory of the entire community was so close to being irreparably damaged or lost. Even after 80 years of settling in Bucha, most of the archival collection were still stored in hundreds of these banana boxes piled to the ceiling in a humid storage space. Nobody knew what was inside of these boxes except Artyom, and he told me briefly. We were kind of opening some of the boxes, the first week when I met him, and I was really fascinated. That seemed to be an archive, probably was the largest collection of religious samizdat, the largest collection belonging to religious community that recorded the underground life of a community. Artyom asked me for help to save this archive and to digitize it. At that moment, I felt completely helpless. How could I digitize this all? But at the same time, I thought that this request probably was the most important in my career, and actually this question, would you help me, gave me back meaning and life and hope. And upon my return, I started searching for opportunities. I joined hundreds of associations of archivists, of historians, and soon an opportunity arose with the Endangered Archives program funded by the British Library. To apply for the grant to digitize the Bucha archive, I had to start from scratch to learn all about digitization techniques, as well as long-term, short-term preservation methods for archives located in conflict zones. I had no idea what I was applying for. But at the same time, I perceived this as my fieldwork, as my new anthropological method as a field researcher. Starting with no knowledge of scanner types or digital camera technologies, I had to acquire advanced skills in digitization and photography in the field. I had to assemble a near-professional photo studio with appropriate equipment and lighting. Furthermore, I had to train an on-site team in skills which I still had to assemble. The whole year before starting the project in August 2023, all I was doing was learning about image standards, lenses, exposure, aperture, type of copy stands, collection care, documents handling, processing digital images, backing up, cataloging, creation of metadata, and all the nightmare I went through. I received invaluable training and advice from various professionals, including archivists from SBU Archive, who agreed to be partners in my project. 12 months later, I loaded with large boxes and suitcases with equipment, including a 20 kilos copy stand for digital camera. I embarked on a long journey to Bucha, the Polish-Ukrainian border. It took us the whole week, including nights, to set up a photo studio within the archive premises, utilizing spare parts and materials we had on hand. Then Artyom and I began digitization, with 2 students later joining our team. We opened boxes, revealing objects, books, manuscripts, and file cards that hadn't seen the light of day for many years. What was most precious of all, each item stirred memories and sparked stories. Artyom recalled every detail. Each object revived feelings, emotions, and senses. We had to assemble a giant blackboard for digital photography. That's more or less how it looked like. We ironed 2 meters long fabric and affixed them on a giant blackboard that we assembled for digital photography. We carefully pieced together fragments of destroyed old photographs, and each item we encountered seemed to have its own story to tell. It evoked new memories and revived old stories, sparking hours of conversation. One of my favorite digital collection that we digitized was about the production of dia films, like film strips with still images that was projected and was used for religious purposes, and it was easier to distribute across all regions, across the communities. This hand copy was clandestinely produced at a television studio in Kharkiv in the 1970s, using spare parts and scrap metals. And it was produced by a renowned artist and a film producer in Kharkiv. Nobody knew that he was secretly Adventist all his life and clandestinely producing dia films for his church. It's just a short, several seconds video. While explaining how it works, this technology, I was getting loads of stories, hours and hours conversations about the history that was completely unknown.
Если надо отматывать, он из плестиглаза в эти катушки сделал. Вот это все сделал сам, все сам, понимаете? Только гайки были и... Это гений был. Вот сюда вставлялось, вот с консервной банки. Он вырезал. Сюда вставлялась пленка. Конечно, в темноте. Сейчас уже это все засвечено, понимаете? Это просто уже как макет для того, чтобы показать. Ну, вот. Вот. Он из старой коробки из-под пленки сделал шаблон такой. Сюда вставлялась пленка, вот эти усики. И сколько надо, ты столько, значит, и отматывал себе пленки для фильма.
The war in Ukraine has exposed many shadowy practices and structures, including those related to the religious life. The experience of death and destruction compel people to look back to the historical roots of the current crisis, bringing forth the ghosts of the past, the lingering Soviet legacy that became so palpable during wartime. Therefore, confronting and re-narrating history through various means, such as revealing stolen or previously secret archives, or digitizing an endangered archive, has become a vital mechanism for grappling with both the historical trauma inflicted by Soviet totalitarianism and the ongoing trauma of the war. This is all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll now call on Indre Cuplinskas from St. Joseph College to make some comments.
Good morning. I am yet another one of the outsider commentators with no specialist knowledge of Ukraine. The furthest east that my own studies go is Lithuania. I'm trained in theology and history, so I'm not an anthropologist. And I'm most conversant in Roman Catholicism. That said, I always appreciate an opportunity to expand my horizons, and I am sympathetic to all of the themes that you're dealing with in your papers. And of course, my ties with Lithuania mean that the war in Ukraine is a conflict that is uncomfortably close to home. So thank you, Denise and Tatiana, for two fascinating papers that expand the transnational landscape of the war, adding to what we've already heard about this morning about the Jewish community and the internet. Your papers focus specifically on minority religious groups and ask questions about identity. Denise, yours focuses on religion and national identity, while Tatiana seems to look at identity as shaped by past and present trauma and religious identities as informed by what seem to be primarily adversarial relationships with the state. So as I read the papers, a number of questions arose, and I'm going to ask them, partially just to get the discussion rolling. They might be useful for you when you polish your papers that you've presented today, and I don't expect you to answer them all. So once I'm done with my comments, we can definitely privilege the questions from the floor. Just some general questions that came to me. So first of all, Denise, your paper makes it abundantly clear that, as with the other religious communities we've been looking at, that there is no one Muslim stance vis-a-vis the war and the Ukrainian state. And as I read your paper, it seems to me that this analysis is further complicated by the fact that there are very different kinds of bodies making statements or stances, right? So in your own paper, you mentioned states, Muslim majority states like Indonesia, there's transnational Muslim community organizations, there are Muslim organizations particular to particular countries, and all the way down to media-savvy Ukrainian Muslim leaders. So we have very different kinds of people speaking to things. And this variety of voices serves to illustrate the complexity of trying to characterize a religious tradition's view of a conflict. At the very beginning of your paper, you raised the issue of identity, that religious people or organizations have to choose whether they are first and foremost believers of their own denominations, or in this case, citizens of Ukraine. And this is a usual place to start, and a very good initial distinction. But again, the question is not so black and white, because as your paper shows, as you move through the different Muslim voices, first of all, there's no Muslim approach to war, and not surprisingly, it seems to me that the variety of Muslim approaches generally seem to stem from a particular Muslim community's location at the end of the day. Their response is different whether they're speaking to the war from Russia, from Chechnya, from Palestine, than from any convictions that stem from their religious beliefs, except perhaps the groups that want to liberate Crimea. So I'm left wondering, is there any common thread at all, or a common element that is the case that all Muslims would share in any way, right? Or is it very much they're just coming from different angles in looking at the war, if that question makes sense? And I think, that can be applied to the Christian groups and so on that we've been looking at. From a theological perspective, I'm always interested on how theological convictions actually play out on the ground. And often, even when groups share a theology, their responses to particular situations are always still coming from different angles. I wouldn't be surprised that your conclusion is no, there is no real common thread, right, even amongst the Muslim communities. So you've outlined 3 positions regarding the war in Ukraine, right? The first one is that there's Muslims who look at it as a war amongst non-Muslim states. If anything, some Muslims will look at that war and just see how it can play out advantageously for them. Right, so that's the first position. The second one is support for Russia, and the third one is support for Ukraine. And you talked about the Muslims in Ukraine they can tend to these various 3 positions. I'm just curious whether you have any examples. Are there active campaigns targeting Muslims in Ukraine to side with any of these positions in particular? So is there activities on the ground that are trying to pull the Muslim population there in one or another direction? And now I turn to Tatiana. So you've presented a captivating and riveting account, and I got to read about all 4 communities in the paper. So the unnamed community, there was a Baptist community, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Seventh-day Adventists, and you, on your paper, or the presentation you gave, you focused on the first and the last. In your paper, you used it to pose larger questions, right? These particular accounts, and a lot of these came through in your presentation. So the first big one is the purpose of archives, right? Whether they are just depositories of data or are they kind of actors in memory making, and that's what you've been really digging into. You also looked at the investigations of the past and memory making as a way to deal with trauma. In your paper, you also raised questions about when is the Soviet and the post-Soviet era over, especially in light of the war. And then the other question that is very personal to you is questions about new methodologies for anthropologists, particularly as participant observers in conflict zones. Besides these general observations that you're making about archives as being used in various ways by members of religious minority communities and individuals to find healing from past trauma of the Soviet era and the present trauma of the war, are there any other patterns that you can observe when you compare all of these instances? Does the community's legal status affect how they're dealing with their archives, right? Because there seem to be communities in the Baptists that you didn't mention here, but that aren't even registered, right? Even in Ukraine now. And you've got moments in which the whole community is kind of involved in processing the archives, right? And there's moments in which it's a very much an individual project, right? Even with Artem, now it's become more of a community project that since he's brought his the archive to Bucha, right? But it seemed to be very much a passion project. So again, is there a moment in which it becomes a community thing, or when or is there something that drives it to be more of a process that is engaged in by an individual? Do the communities that you're looking at, do they interact with each other in any way? Are you kind of the conduit between them? Right, so are these projects that they're doing very much on their own? And also just in what way are their interactions with their archives and the construction of memory, are they influenced in any way by these religious communities' particular theologies, by their eschatologies? When do they imagine things are going to come to an end? And does that shape the way that they deal with their immediate past? And then just an observation, Tatiana, as I read your paper, I began to see parallels between what the archives are undergoing and what you were undergoing as an anthropologist. So this is the bit that I read in your paper. You had Volodymyr the Baptist, who talked about history not just as a subject of study, but a quest for answers to fundamental questions about faith, identity, and resilience. In your work, the archives become not just repositories of information, but sites for dealing with meaning and trauma. And it seems to me that you yourself, like the archives, as an anthropologist, are questioning what your normal or traditional role is as an anthropologist, an observer participant, right? So the war was throwing the archives and you into completely new roles. So it seemed to me you were kind of going through a similar kind of journey where you no longer stand apart or try to take a more objective or impartial view of things. From conversations yesterday at dinner with some of the other conference participants, and I'm probably stating the obvious, life-threatening conflict exposes the porousness of our professional selves, right? That is, we can't draw as clear a line between ourselves as scholars and ourselves as human beings. And wars and conflict challenge us to engage, right, to move from that objective stance. And so that comes out very clearly in your paper, both in your personal journey and in the journey of these archives, that they are suddenly becoming different things and can't delineate as much between their kind of what they are professionally and how the war is impacting them. And then just some last thoughts for both of you, and this is linking back to Scott Appleby's talk yesterday on the role that minority religious groups can play in peacemaking. I returned to your papers wondering whether any of the groups that you have looked at might contribute to peacemaking in any way. This question, I know, is well beyond the scope of your papers, although I was happy to learn that, Denise, that's part of what you think about is peacemaking. So I'm not expecting you to comment on the peacemaking bit here, right, because it is well beyond what you're focusing on. But might the transnational ties that these groups have facilitate peacemaking in the future? And my read, particularly the Christian minority groups, not all of them are very actively engaged in civil society. A number of them seem to be very inward-looking and focused and suspicious. It looks suspiciously upon the outside world and state, but perhaps there's some potential there. So I will stop there, but perhaps on a note of hope that these religious communities may also contribute to eventual peace. Thank you.
I have a question to both presenters. Denise, the question to you is whether you see any dialogue and maybe tensions between Majlis community, other Muslim groups, and a broader society or civil society in discussing the future of Crimea. Because I see this in constitutional dialogue over the sort of future constitution of Ukraine and specifically the status of Crimea. And we see two sort of approaches. The one is that it must be national autonomy of Crimea Tatars, and the second one, no, that it should be completely unitarian state with no specific rights reserved for the Crimea. And the question to Tatiana, I wonder why that professor has preserved his power during the independence. Why they just can't say to him, you know, go jump to the lake. I saw something like that in University Milo, when during Soviet times there was a person running so-called the second department, Druhý výdel, and that person was considered to have some links with KGB. After the independence, that person sort of was considered to preserve these links and having links with SBU, and that's why no one would like to go and to argue with that person. Why that phenomenon of power was preserved?
Yeah, also two questions. The first is I didn't notice mention of Turkey per se in the talk and the relations or changes in the position of Islam and the Erdogan government, obviously given the large number of Crimean Tatars or people of descent in Turkey. So I wonder if you could place that for us, to what degree Turkey plays a role and the changing nature of the Turkish state to Islam makes a difference on these groups. The minority groups, I think we all remember from the beginnings of Ukrainian independence, all of those Mormons who were on planes and in the eyes of some Ukrainians were stealing their ancestors' souls by, doing very good work of getting archival materials out of Ukraine. Thank goodness many of them are now in Salt Lake City. But with the groups that you deal with, is there a North American influence, that is from the Baptists or the other groups, that have changed their attitude towards archives and their movements? So has there already been an external impact in these last 30 years that's changed the way they view history?
Dennis, I've taken it to my heart. You're commenting on how much of a transitional, if you wish, or transnational has been the Islamic participation by certain minorities in Ukraine who have eventually left. And I wanted to come back to the Crimean Tatar case and ask you about the potential dialogue which may have existed between the Crimean Tatar faith community, themselves trying to reposition their place in Ukrainian nation, especially most recently, with the other communities who have chosen not to align with the state and moved on. And to Tanya, being an anthropologist, I appreciate a lot of what has been mentioned in your presentation. And in particular, what struck me as an important argument you're taking on is the objectification and tangibility of memory, which we all are very preoccupied and focused in these days, but anthropologists are well positioned to, in fact, tangibly work with exactly that direction in Ukraine. And war, of course, amplifies the need for the rescue. And that brings me to a second part of the question, whether exploring your own writing journey, you would consider maybe positioning your writing as a rapid response ethnography or a rescue ethnography. I'm not sure I have read something about that, but struggling with these multiple identities of ourselves as academics, and that has been brought up, certainly pushes us as anthropologists to consider framing, arriving at some sort of a framing of what we do and how we write about that. Thank you.
We have a question from Anna Maria. This question is for Tatiana. I noticed a Torah scroll on one of your photos. Am I correct that it is a Torah scroll? And if yes, what is the connection between the community's archive that you digitized in the Jewish community? Thank you.
When we study Ukrainian Muslim, when I say about this small group, very different group in Ukrainian Muslim community, it's now for Ukraine it's normal, especially now, because a lot of Muslim refused, and many Muslim come in Ukraine who want fighting with Russia, and situation in Ukrainian Ummah very dynamic, and this group is small. It's patchwork. Ukrainian Muslim community, it's patchwork community, and many different groups who have connect with transnational movement in other country. You say about Turkey, for example, Crimean Tatars with Turkey, because we say about Crimean Tatar diaspora, biggest Crimean Tatar who live in Ukraine. Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey, 1 or 5 million. And Ukraine, if last information 2001, and 30,000. Diaspora biggest of local Crimean Tatar. And this big problem for Ukrainian government, how build dialogue with Turkey and Crimean Tatar. Because Ukrainian government don't build this dialogue without Turkey. Now maybe as a position, but it's problem. National or autonomy or not national autonomy. And with, in relation with Turkey, there is no real dialogue because of the expressed nationalism in Crimean Tatar, and which acquired, justified historically. It's absolutely normal. But if we say about relations between different Muslim association, Al-Rayed and Ummah, especially Al-Rayed, had Crimean Tatar, Siran Arifov. But religion administration of Muslim Autonomous Republic Crimea not have relation with Al-Rayed because Crimean Tatars say about Mufti must only Crimean Tatar, who near, who close with Majlis, not with Arabian associations, not with Arabian country. He must Crimean Tatar, close to Majlis, close to Turkey. It's a real situation. We must build this dialogue between Majlis, between Muftiyats, between civil society, between government, between Turkey authorities. But it's a real situation.
Thanks for many interesting questions. Regarding the first bunch of questions, I think I would answer with one answer. With the exception of one case, all the cases were just individual initiatives. Therefore, no legal changes in legal status, no any theology involved. In case of Bucha Archive, I had to submit tons of letters of asking the leadership of the church to collaborate with the project and just to allow me or just not to bother me and just give me access to the archive. I had to appeal to their Northern American co-believers in the USA and asking them, would you please help me to do my job? I don't ask anything, just leave me alone there. With one exception, Jehovah's Witnesses. In this case, it was centralized. My project had passed a long procedure of clearance with the leadership of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It took them a month to clear my project, to agree to collaborate. In this case, yes, it's reflected, it's corresponded with both legal and theological change with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and their turn towards more civil church-oriented model, opening themselves and trying to find themselves as members of a civil society, as members of Ukrainian country. And in this case, I think, yes, their collaboration with me, and they have transferred me so far like 10 gigabytes of material, saying that's just a tiny portion of the archive they have, that was related to their change in both legal status and theological. In terms of my journey in archive, I think I became an archive, literally. By now, I have 2 terabytes of big data material, and I not really understand what to do with this. Peacemaking, thanks for asking this question. I have written actually this in Kathy Warner's book. All these 4 cases that I write about, they share one thing, they're pacifist. While working with the archive, we've been processing and analyzing what's mean to be a pacifist in times of war. My favorite quote from a Jehovah's Witness who says, "All I know is that there was not a single Russian who would be killed from the hands of Ukrainian Jehovah's Witness, but all I know also that there wouldn't be not Ukrainian who would be killed by Russian Jehovah's Witness." So that was kind of a foundation of their peace-building approach. Why Professor has preserved his powers? Thanks for asking this question. And actually, when we were discussing the project about религиоведческая expertise, a legal expert in religious studies, that was the case. I meant maybe together with you as a legal scholar, if we could do something together, because I think I need some advice in terms of legality, how I can approach this case. 2 things to say. There was no illustration process, therefore he remained in power. Second, is just a quote from a book and a film, I made an offer, they could not resist. He made this relationship mutually interdependent. Why I cannot say this now, because I still have to understand how to anonymize this, because it was quite serious corruption involved in this. North American impact, thanks for this question. I have no idea how to answer, but I would be thinking about that. That reminded me why my first idea when I wrote to American Adventists and asked them to help as a kind of people who would appreciate what I am doing, that's probably something was unconsciously that I have to still to search what kind of impact was this giant out-migration of these communities. There was a big diaspora of Baptists, for example, to Sacramento, just now predominantly Russian and Ukrainian speaking. And the last thing, methodology, when I realized that participant observation is not irrelevant, even participant observation, not talking about interviewing, was not a relevant methodology, at least to me. It was ethically unacceptable to me. In this case, yes, rescuing and collaborative anthropology is something that I'm discovering for myself as my own both personal and professional experience. And Torah, yes, I didn't mention, because Bucha archive is not only about Adventists, is the archive that was created in Crimea. Artyom, the owner of this archive, has been collecting materials from indigenous population, from old Armenian, from Krimchak, Karaim. So that's a unique archive, and Torah came one of those communities from Crimea. Thank you.
That was a really interesting discussion, and I have to thank both speakers and discussant for their very perceptive comments. So thank you very much.